Hey y'all, welcome to this week's show. We will, as promised, discuss Hypericum this week. That's St. John's wort. Really one of the, most interesting herbs that I know of. There are actually 14 varieties of St. John's wort that have documented use in herbal medicine, so I won't name them all. And native to my area are, how many? I will try to name those. Let's see, Buckley St. John's wort, Round Pod St. John's wort, St. Andrew's Cross or St. Peter's wort, Bushy St. John's wort, Peelbark St. John's wort, Bedstraw St. John's wort, St. Andrew's Cross, Sandhill St. Andrew's Cross, Carolina St. John's wort. That one's actually just here in the Carolinas. Early St. John's wort, Shrubby St. John's wort, and that's the one I have in my yard. Another one called St. Andrew's Cross, Pineland St. Andrew's Cross, and Atlantic St. John's wort, and one that was brought in from Europe. I think it's Hypericum frondosum, I believe. It could actually be an Asian one. But anyway, St. John's wort, truly one of the most useful and storied herbs in the entire history of herbal medicine. Dioscorides wrote of St. John's wort, 2,500 years ago or something. Hypericum is a shrubby, where it grows in Greece. He actually went throughout the entire empire. He traveled along with the soldiers. So, anyway, in his region, it was a shrub about 20 centimeters high. That's much like the one that grows in my yard. A lot of them grow just like wildflowers. You may get one that's sort of a shrub or bush form, and you might get one that's just a tender wildflower. I often see those throughout the state and everywhere I go. Really a fairly common plant. But anyway, after he describes it, I guess the main thing to remember, it's just got these bright, pretty yellow flowers. When you see that, pull up your plant ID app, pull up your, grab a field guide or whatever, and see if it's a St. John's wort. Of course, there are a lot of yellow flowers, but once you identify it once, you'll recognize it everywhere. I mean, it really can be kind of weedy. It can be very widespread. He says it is diuretic. Would help with the menstrual issues. Decoction taken as a drink with wine dries away fevers with paroxysm, that's actually spasms or seizures, that occur every third or fourth day. So that would be tertian or quatern fevers, which usually are malarial in nature, but COVID actually has that same, aspect to it. Several viruses do. The ones that really kind of never go away, like long COVID or malaria. And Yeah, I mentioned before that Sir Walter Raleigh, he went from being a real hero of the British Empire to on the outs with the king because he may have been fooling around with the queen or something, right? He was beheaded, and he had malaria, and he had, I believe, tertian fever, so every third day, and they came so regularly, he knew exactly what time of day he was going to get his fever, and he asked to be beheaded just before the fever struck because very, very bad fevers. Um, the St. John's wort is also a really good herb for anything like that because it has antiviral properties. It's one of our very best antivirals, in fact. Not the strongest, but it's very broad spectrum. It's very useful. Let's see. It says a decoction of the seed taken as a drink for 40 days cures sciatica. I don't know. I don't know. I have never even had a decoction of the drink made from the seed, and that's quite a commitment to take something for 40 days. But heck, I get sciatica. Maybe I'll give it a try. Had some really bad back injuries when I was younger, and the sciatic nerve was really what was affected. But I don't know. I have used St. John's wort topically. St. John's wort is actually very good for nerve pain, both internally and externally. I've taken, capsule form. I've used tinctures of it, but as an oil, it helps with bruising and muscle and nerve pain. Um, it actually helps with nerve regeneration. St. John's wort is one of the few plants that can help stimulate the healing and regeneration of damaged nerves. Very important. Um, it says the leaves applied together with the seed heal burns, and it gets into different names that it was called in that region a couple thousand years ago. We don't have to worry about that. He mentions two other types of St. John's wort. Uh, One of the interesting things about St. John's wort is when you do infuse the oil, and this is somewhat true with tinctures as well, it makes it bright red. These yellow flowers put a bright red pigment in there, and the darker, brighter, redder it is, brighter, redder. I don't know if that's proper, but the more potent it is. So that's one way you can really evaluate the strength of St. John's wort. And he pretty much gives the same uses for both of these other ones, except the other one, the last one he calls androsamium, and it was more of the like wildflower form, I think is the way I would put it. And he said it was good to help expel bilious excrement and especially cures sciatica. One sip of water after the purge, one must sip water after the purge, and the herb smeared on heals burns and stops blood. And it was also called Dionysius or Ascaron. All right, so getting up to a little bit more modern, 1500s, so quite more modern than Dioscorides, but still pretty not modern to us. Gerard in England wrote, St. John's wort with its flowers and seeds, boiled and drunken, provoketh wine, and it is good against the stone in the bladder. It stoppeth the lask. The leaves stamped are good to be laid upon burning, scaldings, and all wounds, and also for rotten and filthy ulcers. The leaves, flowers, and seeds stamped, put into a glass with olive oil, and set in the hot sun for certain weeks together, and then drained from those herbs, and the like quality of new put in, and sunned in a like manner, doth make an oil the color of blood, which is a most precious remedy for deep wounds, and those that are through the body, for sinews that are pricked, and wounds made with a venomed weapon, poisoned weapon even. I am accustomed to make a compound oil hereof, the making of which ye shall receive at my hands, because that I know in the world there is not a better nor a more natural balsam itself, for I dare to undertake to cure any such wound as absolutely in each respect, if not sooner and better, as any man whatsoever shall or may with natural balsam. So Gerard was a little boastful sometimes. But yes, it is very good for wounds. It is very good for burns. It is very good for bruises, sore muscles. It's second only in effectiveness for bruising and such to arnica. Great for sprains. Really good. And you can use the two together, definitely. The old writers, as he said, would put the dried flowers, they need to be thoroughly dry. And I think he said flowers, leaves, and seeds. But it does have to be thoroughly dry or it can spoil the oil. It can start to rot in the oil. So first of all, they have to be carefully dried, in a shady place. And this is what's kind of strange. You dry herbs in the shade in dry air with, good airflow. It, they dry faster when it's hot. So I like to use my attic, of course, or even a hot car sometimes. But it does need to be out of the sun because the sun oxidizes and damages the medicinal quality of the plant. But all the old writers said to infuse the oil in the sun. From Gerard in the 1500s to like Father Nape, and everybody used a sun infusion, I guess you would say, to make this infused oil, the heat of the sun. I think you're better off doing it not in the sunlight because the sun has that same oxidizing quality, really like a slow cooker on the very lowest temp. You don't want to get it real hot. The top of your hot water heater works pretty well. Turn the oven on, like let it warm up to the lowest temp, turn it off, and then just stick it in there for a few hours. You don't want deep fried herbs, That's what I do. But then again, St. John's wort has a certain relationship with sunlight that's kind of hard to explain. If you take St. John's wort in large quantities for a long period of time, you can actually get a sensitivity to sunlight. You can sunburn more easily. It's really hard to... The energetics of the plant do have some correlation to sunlight. And it's really such a bright, sunny yellow flower, it kind of makes sense that it does have some kind of relationship to sunlight. But what it is, I don't know and I can't explain, and I'm not going to venture that far. So this is one that while I think you're better off using modern methods of making infused oil, you probably couldn't go too wrong actually using the sunlight, and there may actually be some benefit to it. I don't know. He goes on, he says, take white wine, 2 pints, and 4 pounds of olive oil, together with oil of turpentine of 2 pounds, so it's a lot of turpentine, the leaves and flowers of St. John's wort, and 2 great handfuls, gently bruised. Put them all together in a double glass and set it in the sun for 10 days. Then boil them in the same glass in a kettle of warm water with some straw in the bottom. Okay, that's to keep the glass from shattering. Where the glass must stand to boil, which is done, and then strain the liquor from the herbs and putting in a like quantity of flowers and seeds, but not any more wine, and you will have a great secret for the purpose aforesaid. So he thought that was really good for winds too. Victorian English. It's kind of hard to Elizabethan English, actually. It's kind of hard to read sometimes. But yeah, he was quite fond of the herb, and as I said, he was a bit boastful. He was actually the Queen's gardener, and he managed a huge garden. He wasn't a great botanist, but he was a great gardener. Miss Grieve in 1930s England gets much more modern use after describing the plant again. And as I said, there's so many varieties of them. Basically, just look for the yellow flowers, bright, bright yellow flowers, and then identify it by the leaf and the stem, which can be a little reddish sometime, because they can look very different. There are so many varieties of St. John's wort that really don't look alike at all, except for the flower and the leaf, but the flower is the main thing. She said, under medicinal actions and uses. Well, first of all, she gives a little interesting history. She said there are many ancient superstitions regarding this herb. Its name, Hypericum, is derived from the Greek and means over an apparition, a reference to the belief that the herb was so obnoxious to evil spirits that a whiff of them would cause them to fly. Wow. Anyway, and if I remember correctly, the name St. John's wort is because it's said to bloom on St. John's Day. And it's always had religious connotation, especially in Poland. Maybe we can get into that a little bit. So medicinal actions and uses: aromatic, astringent, resolvent, expectorant, and nervine. Used in all pulmonary complaints, bladder troubles, in suppression of urine, dysentery, worms, diarrhea, hysteria, and nervous depression. Hematopsis and other hemorrhages and jaundice. For children troubled with incontinence of urine at night, an infusion or tea given before retiring will be found effectual. It is also useful in pulmonary consumption, chronic catarrh of the lungs, bowels, or urinary passages, and externally for fomentations to dispel hard tumors, cake, breast, and something I can't pronounce, ecchymosis. Ecchymosis. I'm going to have to look that one up. I don't know that one. And her recommendations for preparation and dosage, really simple. Actually, just 1 ounce of the dried herb infused in a pint of water and 1 to 2 tablespoons taken as a dose. Simple, super simple. And she said an oil of St. John's wort was made from the flowers infused in olive oil. Yeah, I've only used the flowers. Gerard said flowers, leaves, and seeds. I really have never even never experimented with the seeds at all. It's just the flowers that I'm really aware of. Now, in the Irish tradition, John Kehoe said that St. John's wort provokes the urine and breaks up the stone in the bladder. It stops diarrhea and cures fevers. The seed, boiled and drunk for 40 days, heals sciatica. So we know where he got that information from. And if pounded, it makes an effective application to burns, wounds, and boils. And really, we shouldn't be too surprised by that, that he would be knowledgeable of Dioscorides' work. Ireland was one of the first great outposts of Catholicism. I mean, Catholicism spread through the Germanic countries first, and France and all that, but there was a big monastic culture in Ireland. Some of the most beautiful hand transcribed and engraved Bibles, artwork, drawn by monks, were in Ireland. St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland very early. He was a Roman citizen who was captured by Irish pirates and sold into slavery. He escaped, went back, became a monk, and heard the voice of God tell him to go to Ireland and, Christianize the country, and he did. And there were Viking invasions that really destroyed the early churches and monasteries, and then, Ireland became a very Catholic nation, but it never really hit that height again. But some of the most educated of all the monks were Irish, or those from the continent that moved to Ireland as monks, and with them, especially those coming from the continent, were bringing Dioscorides herbal. They said, I can't remember, I was watching a program one time, and I think this was like in the Alps, Austrian Alps. This is like 1970s, and there were still monks practicing herbal medicine using hand-copied volumes of Dioscorides herbal. So, I mean, anywhere the monks went, they took Dioscorides with them. That was a very huge part of Catholic herbal medicine. And, for 1,500 years, there was only one Christian church. That was the Catholic Church. And it's, kind of schismatic brother, the Orthodox. And but 90% of the world was Catholic. 99% of Christians in the world were Catholic. And all the hospitals were free hospitals operated by the Catholic Church, like by the Benedictines and the Jesuits. They had free hospitals. All the orphanages, all the schools, every school on the face of the earth, basically, at least in the Western world, was Catholic. And they did a very good job of passing down books, which were pretty rare at the time. You got to remember, most people were illiterate until very recently. Only in the past 100 years or so did we get to anything approaching universal literacy. Most people couldn't read, and books were incredibly expensive because they had to be copied by hand until Gutenberg came along, and his goal was to print Catholic Bibles. He was a Catholic, and he printed Catholic Bibles with the authority of the Catholic Church behind him, contrary to many anti-Catholic Protestant claims that, Catholics aren't allowed to read the Bible, or Catholics weren't allowed to own Bibles. No, The stated goal of Gutenberg was to print Catholic Bibles so everyone could have one, and the Douay Rheims predates the King James Version and is a much more accurate and complete Bible. So whenever you hear someone say Catholics aren't allowed to read the Bible, understand that's a bigoted, ignorant statement that has no foundation in truth whatsoever. Now, there were false versions of the Bible printed, mistaken translations, or Bibles that were purposefully changed to change the words of Christ in the Bible, to change to suit false doctrines. And at different times, the Catholic Church said, no, that Bible is no good. You need to stick with a Catholic Bible, such as the Douay Rheims, which dates back around 1500, and it's a translation of the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, which was translated by Saint Jerome from Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts into Latin in right around 400, and was the official Bible of the Catholic Church, I believe. It may have been, which council was it? Nicene Council, I believe, like 477 A.D. Was declared the official Catholic Bible, and there wasn't another Bible until the 1500s. But not everybody could read Latin, so that's actually why you have a priest get up and read to you from the Bible in Mass and give a homily explaining it, because most people were illiterate. That's why we have stained glass windows. They told stories from the Bible. Yeah, so just remember, Christians didn't have a Bible for over 300 years. They had some books of the Old Testament that most of them couldn't read because they were in Hebrew and they spoke Greek, but even if they spoke Greek, they were probably illiterate. All they had was the oral teaching passed down by the apostles. They had the letters of, like, if you were in, if you look in the Bible, we've got the letter of St. Paul to this church, the letter of St. Paul to this church, a small book, of Peter, and you've got the Gospels. If you were lucky if you were in a church and you had one copy of one book of the New Testament. They all had a document called the Didache, which means the teachings of the 12, which gave the basics of Christian belief and how and when one should worship. And I mean, it actually spells out, Christians go to church on Sunday, and that church is a Catholic church with the Eucharist and the Holy Mass. There's no other church, believe it or not. And that's all they had for over 300 years. And then St. Jerome was able to translate the entire Bible into the common language of the time, which is Latin. And really, that remained the main text until those monks in Ireland started translating the Latin into Gaelic. There were Gaelic Bibles that predate English language Bibles by centuries, and they're beautiful. They're just absolutely gorgeous. And they also translated Dioscorides Herbal and such as that into the common language where they were. They'd take it from Latin and they'd write it out in Gaelic, or they'd write it out in German, or they'd write it out in French. And that's how the Catholic Church preserved the medical knowledge of Greece and ancient Rome. And, founded the first hospitals and taught the first doctors, and that's the way things went for a good 1,500 years. And then really, when it's the rise of the nation state that came along with Protestantism that started the guilds and the professional medical schools that are totally divorced from religious teaching and practice, and got more, that's what started the chemical pharmaceutical industry, and banning the use of herbs in medical practice, because it's always the guilds, whether it's the American Medical Association, which is, the modern version of one of those guilds that said, if you're not an approved physician, if you're not an approved apothecist or pharmacist, you can't practice. You will go to jail for that. Well, Paracelsus faced that a lot. He was actually hunted from country to country. Yeah, that's the beginning of modern medicine and taking it away from its natural roots. And, if you want to learn about that, my book, The History of Christian Herbal Medicine, probably the only text that really gives that history. And it is actually fascinating. Um, it's also my most controversial book because you got a lot of neo-pagans, a lot of, witches and Wiccans and people who claim to be druids, even though they have no idea what druids actually believed or practiced because druids were illiterate and didn't leave them records. you know, um, they hate it. They absolutely hate it when I point out, like St. Hildegard von Bingen or Father Nape or Father Kunz or Abbot Walfrid Strabo as preserving herbal medicine. They just want to believe that, the Catholic Church is evil and condemned everybody who have made a chamomile tea as being a witch and burned them at the stake or something. Total fiction, total lies. They hate it. And of course, a lot of Protestants who have anti Catholic bigotry, bias, hate it as well. I got one really nasty review on there. The lady says, "This isn't a Christian book, it's a Catholic book." And, Amazon won't take it down. If she had said that about a Jewish author, they would have called it bigotry and taken it down. If she had said that about a Chinese author, they would call it bigotry and take it down. I could go down the list. Um, but I guess it's okay on Amazon to say that Catholics aren't Christian, which is, utterly fallacious. I mean, there was only one Christian church until Martin Luther and King Henry VIII. There was not another church other than, the slightly schismatic Orthodox Church, and that was at that time basically just Greek. Orthodoxy hadn't spread into Russia and other areas. At that time, the Orthodox Church was just Greek, and it was mainly just a dispute over language. It actually has today is actually the solemnity of the Holy Trinity, the understanding in Greek Orthodox theology, which has now been adopted by Russian Orthodox and your other Eastern Orthodox churches, of the nature of the Trinity differs ever so slightly from the Catholic understanding of it. And that's basically the only thing they disagree on, which is really weird. I mean, honestly, most Catholics and most Orthodox have no idea what the so-called filioque actually is and why they have a different understanding of the nature of the second person of the Trinity, and why a few hundred years ago that was a controversy. Now things changed over time, and the Orthodox churches will not accept the authority of the Pope, and but really probably could have reunited, the two churches reunited decades ago were it not for political influence. The Orthodox churches were actually under the rule of a Muslim caliph for a couple hundred years, and that's when they really began to oppose the Pope because the caliph demanded loyalty, and they couldn't be loyal to the Pope in Rome and also not get their heads cut off by a Muslim ruler. Understandable. I'm not criticizing them at all for that. But then, of course, the same thing happened to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union thoroughly controls, to this day, the Russian well, its ancestor now. I mean, it's not ancestor, it's a descendant, which is, just Russia, which is still very much the same old KGB as under the Soviet Union. The government of Russia or Soviet Union or whatever you want to call it still has tremendous influence in the Orthodox churches. I don't necessarily agree with Zelensky, but I understand why he cracked down on the Orthodox churches in Ukraine because their loyalty is first and foremost to Russia. Um, you know, what are you going to do? We've been through a good 100 years of the Russian government literally dictating who can be their, like, basically priests and bishops and what they can teach and what they can say and do in their churches. And there's spies in every single Russian Orthodox church. Um, and if somebody stepped out of line, you got to remember the Soviet Union was officially atheist, but they allowed the Orthodox churches to operate so long as they could control and demand their loyalty. Had it not been for that, the ridiculous little schism over, whether or not to use Latin or Greek, and whatever the filioque is, it has to do with the nature of Jesus, essentially. Um, and really in his relationship to the Father and the Holy Spirit. And it's so esoteric. Even most people that get worked up and argue about it don't even know what they're talking about. I mean, really. It's just weird, honestly. But eventually the Orthodox and Catholic Church will reunite. But anyway you look at it, both were very influential in spreading the knowledge of herbal medicine. In the Greek world, especially and even you can put in a large amount of the Muslim physicians. They were essential to preserving the knowledge of Galen. Galen, the Roman military physician, he wrote a lot. Really not a good guy, but he made a lot of advances in surgery and such, and that's why really the Muslim physicians, the Mohammedans as they were called at the time, were more advanced in surgical practice than the Romans and certainly Germans in the Middle Ages. If you ever watch the old Kevin Costner version of Robin Hood, they actually make a slight reference to that. The Muslim guy that was with him, that broke out of the jail with him, was a physician, and he did a C-section, a cesarean. That was unknown in England in the Middle Ages. That was not done. But they had the advanced knowledge of medicine, really, in the Islamic world at that point. They were far more sophisticated. So anyway, just like I said, it's the history and the lore that always keeps me interested in herbal medicine. I just find it fascinating. So now let's turn to the German tradition. Father Nape wrote, St. John's wort, on account of its great effect, formerly bore the name of witch's herb. Nowadays, both itself and its services are quite forgotten. So it's always had a spiritual context, even when it was a superstitious one. This is when really it was purposefully named after St. John, so it would take away that connotation of witchcraft. He said, this medicinal herb has a particular influence on the liver. Its tea is an excellent remedy for it. A small admixture of aloe powder increases the effect, which can be observed chiefly in the urine. Whole flakes of morbid matter are sometimes washed away with it. Head complaints arising from watery matters or obstructions of phlegm in the head or from the gases rising to the head, such as spasms, slight obstructions of phlegm in the chest and lungs, are healed at once by a tea made of St. John's wort. Mothers who are caused a great deal of trouble and anxiety by their little bedwetters should tell us much about the strong effects of such tea. If St. John's wort is not to be had, common yarrow, Sacchalia millefolium, may be used in all the given cases. And there's a lot of, like I said, St. John's wort is second only to arnica for healing bruises and sprains and swelling. St. John's wort is second really to yarrow in internal bleeding, diarrhea, very astringent, So Brother Aloysius was Father Nape's protege. He said it is used for lung complaints, chronic catarrh, that's congestion, asthma, chills, bladder catarrh, and if the urine is thick, it is also used for hysteria, jaundice, absence of menstruation due to illness, green sickness, blood spitting, leukorrhea, pneumonia, rheumatism, fever, intestinal blockage, dysentery, nervous cramps, and uterine cramps. Leaves and flowers boiled in olive oil are a good remedy for sores and contusions. For shivering and shaking in those who suffer from the nerves, this oil should be rubbed on twice a day. For bruises, a cloth dipped in this oil should be placed in the affected area. To strengthen the tendons, rub them twice a day with this oil. Now, we talked about how a lot of the old herbalists would say infuse the plant in sunlight. Brother Aloysius says boiled in oil. Not a good idea, actually. Uh, Obviously, if it's not completely dry, it's going to pop and spit in the oil. Uh, but if it is completely dry, you're just going to deep fry your herbs. I still say that a slow infusion at a low temperature is the best way to go. Now, Father Kunzel, the Austrian herbalist, said St. John's wort can be recognized immediately by the blood. If you squeeze a half-open blossom between your fingernails, blood will come out. It's really a yellow juice. It's useless if it has no blood, as he said. You can find St. John's wort on sunny edges of meadows and empty farmland, semi-dry soils, very often in mountain pastures in the Alps. The latter are the smallest and have the darkest blood. The leaves and blossoms of St. John's wort made into tea clear the head, clean the mucus from the lungs, stomach, kidney, and bladder. If the infusion is red, take a sip of this tea every hour. It also often helps with blood cramps and abdominal pains. St. John's oil is very famous, and he tells how he makes the oil. And let's see, he uses sunlight. So, yeah, I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but it's still probably better. You know what? Try it both ways. He said, if the small, this is interesting. Okay. First of all, okay, use of the oil, he says, it quenches internal and external gangrene in humans and cattle. It relieves pains from burns and scalds, also from lumbago and rheumatic pain by rubbing it in. It is also used internally for colic. It is used for stab wounds, cuts, bruises, and should therefore not be missing in any home. Sage advice. But he said, if the small, well-behaved cat gets a need, I don't know what that means. Give him a few drops of St. John's wort oil. If an honest, hard-working domestic chicken has a symptom of cough or watery eyes or some inner burn so that it stands around with its tail hanging, give it some oil. So he was big on herbs for livestock and animals as well. Maria Treben, the great Austrian herbalist who wrote such wonderful books in the 70s and 80s, Health from God's Pharmacy, Help from God's Garden. She did probably more than anyone to revive the very, very Catholic tradition of Germanic herbal medicine. She said, first of all, she describes how to identify it. And then she says, old Christian beliefs connect to the fragrant red juice of the flower with the blood and wounds of Jesus Christ. The fact is that St. John's wort oil is the best wound oil. It soothes the pain, is anti-inflammatory and healing. Legends dedicate this herb to St. John the Baptist. In earlier times, maidens twisted garlands of St. John's wort and wore them dancing around the fire on St. John's Day. This is very much part of the Polish tradition. Let's see, she says, in this mysterious night, the branches of the herb were thrown into the water to show the maidens who their suitor would be in the next year. You know, old superstition, tradition, but it's nice. It's a nice custom. And she was in Austria. I've read a lot about that in Poland and Ukraine as well. So probably most of the Germanic world kind of had similar probably pre-Christian traditions that were then kind of rebranded as Christian. She said, according to an old custom, the farmers in Upper Austria fed St. John's wort placed between 2 layers of bread to animals to keep them from all diseases. In these days, it is only done rarely. St. John's wort tea is used for injured nerves and nervous affections, for injuries caused by a blow, as well as the consequence of strains. For neuralgia, 2 to 3 cups of St. John's wort tea are sipped and the area rubbed with St. John's wort oil. Speech disorders, fitful sleep, hysterics, sleepwalkers are remedied with St. John's wort, as well as bedwetting and depression. My experiences show that for all these disorders, besides the use of the tea internally, sitz baths can be very comfortable. Sitz bath with St. John's wort added to it. That means sit in a tub. They used to use a wash tub, and you just basically get your butt in there. Now, we have bathtubs. Girls during puberty should drink 2 cups of this tea daily for a length of time. It strengthens the female organs and promotes regular menstruation. Yeah, she talks a lot about the oil, but we've really already covered um, those uses. Um, yep, she did the. Let's see, did she do the? Yeah, she did the sun, or for the oil, infusing the oil, putting it near a stove, and she said it both worked just fine. So I'm going to stick with my way of doing it anyway. Um, yeah, so the sitz bath, she actually gives instructions for it. A bucket full of St. John's wort, stems, leaves, and flower, steeped in cold water overnight. Everything brought to a boil the next morning, and the liquid added to the bath water. Bath should last for 20 minutes. The Ashkenazi Jews use St. John's wort quite a bit. Let's see, this is Deatra Cohen, and I cannot remember her co-author. It's not coming to me right now. She says that, as in other parts of the Soviet Union between the world wars, traditional healers in the Pale, that's where most of the Ashkenazi Jews lived, it was sort of a ghetto of sorts, relied on Hypericum perforatum as a remedy for many of the ailments of their community suffered. Out of almost 100 towns and villages examined between the wars, the vast majority reported medicinal knowledge of St. John's wort, attesting to the herb's important role in Eastern European folk healers' repertoire. The herb was commonly found in meadows and hills among the shrubs of Ukraine. In places I cannot pronounce, traditional healers treated skin disorders with the herb. You know how Poland, Ukraine, a lot of those places, Czechoslovakia, it's like they throw every consonant they can find into one word, and I can't pronounce them. Can't even try to pronounce them. Folk healers relied on preparations of St. John's wort to treat various intestinal ailments and kidney troubles in almost 20 settlements. The same folk healers, plus several others, likely Feldshers. Feldshers were like amateur doctors, I guess, that you would put it that way. They had apprenticed under a Feldsher or doctor, and they would be paid for their services in the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition. They were apothecasts, they were doctors, but they normally did not have medical degrees or licenses. They used it to treat cases of diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, and let's see, the plant tops were used for respiratory ailments such as cough and shortness of breath, pneumonia and lung diseases. For kidney, blood, and metabolic diseases, healers in another place I cannot pronounce turn to this herb. For headaches caused by anemia or dizziness, a decoction of the herb either washed the hair of both the young and old afflicted by this ailment or was given as a drink. If a person or cow was bitten by a mad dog in, I'm going to try this one, Basilia, it's actually got a few vowels, a decoction of St. John's wort was given to help cure the infection. An ointment was prepared for head colds. A plant tincture was used for washing wounds. Fresh or festering sores were treated with an ointment made from the dried flowers. She says the most interesting applications of St. John's wort in the Pale are the remedies for nervous system conditions. These treatments seem to anticipate contemporary research done in the last part of the 20th century that highlights the plant's ability to calm anxiety and depression. Yes, we haven't even discussed that. St. John's wort is very good, especially for seasonal depression. Seems to help with serotonin. Which is also calming in cases of anxiety. In Poland, St. John's wort seems to have been as much used as a deterrent for evil spirits as a medicinal remedy. Sophie Hoderick-Snab says, hung in a window, it protected a house against lightning. Up until the 20th century, it was also believed to protect new mothers and infants against evil spirits when tucked into the crevices and chimneys of the house. For this reason, the midwife often tucked a sprig of the plant under a new mother's pillow and hung some around the neck of an infant until the child's first bath. This was especially true in and around the rural countryside of Krakow. By the 16th century, it was used as a diuretic and for healing wounds, burns, and ulcers. The fresh flowers were soaked in spiritus and applied to wounds, as well as old ones that refused to heal. Spiritus is essentially vodka. I mean, a very strong, high-proof, like Aquavita or something like that. A Russian herbal tells us, according to an old Russian proverb, it is as impossible to make bread without flour as it is to heal people without St. John's wort. Wow, huh? This herb was so popular in early Russia that Tsar Michael I issued a special order that no less than 100 pounds of this herb be collected each year and delivered to his court. Also very popular in Native American herbal medicine. The Cherokee had two varieties. Hypericum hypericoides was used to give babies strength. Bathe them in a warm or cold root tea. Some babies will walk in at 8 or 9 months like this. Make a tea with as much as you can hold in your hand to break a fever. Drink this and go to bed, and also used for snakebite. The perforatum, which is more commonly used. The top leaves are made into a tea for bloody flux. It's diarrhea, essentially. Beat the roots fine and make a cold root tea. Drink as much as you can for bowel complaints. The Lumbee used St. John's wort, according to a Lumbee herbal. The plant was called Euphha tachitne, or raccoon tree leaf. Raccoon tree leaves. In the traditional Lumbee language. Mr. Vernon Cooper, we've mentioned him before. He's a pretty famous Lumbee herbalist that I believe I actually met when I was a kid. But anyway, he made a tonic using St. John's wort, or also known by the Lumbee as St. John the Worker, by combining the male and female varieties, that's the small and larger plants, so that they could be used for either men or women. He suggested that early stages of diabetes could be helped, that the individual should use this tonic, in other words. For later stages of diabetes, Mr. Cooper called sugar in the bone, or neuritis, he would occasionally use St. John's wort, wild cherry bark, ground huckleberry. He also used tonic of the female variety of St. John the Worker to treat body trouble in women. The Cherokee make an infusion. That's interesting. They didn't mention that in the Cherokee herbal. Says the Cherokee make an infusion of St. John the Worker to be sniffed up the nose to treat nosebleed. The Alabama used the tea made from the entire plant to treat dysentery. Resources of Southern Fields and Forests, 1860s, said that it is beneficially administered in suppression of urine, chronic urinary infections, diarrhea, dysentery, worms, jaundice, menorrhagia, hysteria, hematopsis. Externally applied to cake breast, hard tumors. It proves of service. King's Medical Dispensatory, 1898. St. John's wort is an abundant herb growing in this country and Europe. They go through all the description, all that. Let's get to just actions, medicinal uses, and dosages. Well, this is a pharmacy manual. Astringent, sedative, and diuretic, used in suppression of the urine, chronic urinary affections, in diarrhea, dysentery, worms, jaundice, menorrhagia, hysteria, nervous affections with depression, hematopsis, and other hemorrhages. Hypericum has an undoubted power of the nervous system, and particularly the spinal cord. Homeopathic physicians regard it as the arnica of that structure. It can be used in injuries of the spine and lacerated and punctured wounds in the limbs to prevent tetanic complications and to relieve the excruciating pains of such injuries. It is highly valued by Webster in spinal irritation, when upon gentle pressure the spinous process of the vertebrae, burning pain is elicited. Throbbing of the whole body in nervous individuals, fever being absent, is said to be good indication for hypericum. Specifics it says for spinal injuries, shocks, concussions, throbbing of the whole body without fever, spinal irritation that elicits tenderness and burning pain upon slight pressure, spinal injuries, and lacerated and punctured wounds of the extremities with excruciating pain, hysteria, and locally for wounds, contusions, etc. Jethro Kloss, 1920s, said medicinal properties: aromatic, nervine, astringent, resolvent, sedentary, diuretic, and vulnerary. Is powerful as a blood purifier. Very good for tumors and boils as well as for chronic uterine troubles, pains following childbirth, suppressed urine, diarrhea, dysentery, and jaundice. Will correct irregular menstruation. Good in hysteria and nervous afflictions. Excellent for pus in the urine. Good used externally, and an ointment for cake breast, all wounds, ulcers, and sores. Will correct bedwetting children when proper diet is given. The seeds steeped in boiling water will expel congealed blood from the stomach. For this purpose, use a heaping teaspoon of the seeds to a cup of boiling water and take a mouthful several times a day. Wow. All right, modern use now. Plants for future. Medicinal use of St. John's wort. St. John's wort has a long history of herbal use. It fell out of favor in the 19th century, but recent research has brought it back to prominence as an extremely valuable remedy for nervous problems. In clinical trials, about 67% of patients with mild to moderate depression improved when taking this plant. The flowers and leaves are analgesic, antiseptic, antispasmodic, aromatic, astringent, cholagogue, digestive, diuretic, expectorant, nervine, resolvent, sedative, stimulant, vermifuge, vulnerary. And vulnerary, that means wound healing. The herb is used in treating a wide range of disorders, including pulmonary complaints, bladder problems, diarrhea, and nervous depression. It is also very effectual in treating overnight incontinence of urine in children. Externally, is used in poultices to dispel hard tumors, cake breast, bruising, etc. The flowering shoots are harvested. Okay, we don't need to get into all that. So, yes, really good. And it mentions that it was being researched as an AIDS remedy, even. Peterson Field Guide to Eastern Central Medicinal Plants says fresh flowers used in tea or tincture or olive oil, once a popular domestic medicine for treatment of external ulcers, wounds, sores, cuts, bruises. Tea, a folk remedy for bladder ailments, depression, dysentery, diarrhea, and worms. Experimentally as sedative, anti-inflammatory, and antibacterial. Contains the biologically active compounds choline, pectin, rutin, sitosterol. Oh, I can't. I'm just going to spell it. Sitosterol. Hypericin and pseudohypericin have potent antiretroviral activity without serious side effects, being researched for AIDS treatment. Warning, taken internally or externally. Hypericin may cause photodermatitis, that is on sensitive people exposed to light. So it can make you more susceptible to sunburn, as we mentioned. So, wow, huh? I mean, Hypericum St. John's wort, as I said, one of the most storied, fascinating, impressive, medically useful of all herbs. And that, I'm glad I got through that one because it was a long one. All right, y'all. Do learn to identify St. John's wort in the wild. This is one I would say always have on hand, especially for wounds and sores and such as that. And as an antiviral. And fortunately, because it did become popular in the right around 2000 or so, as for especially seasonal depression, you can probably find a good quality St. John's wort in just about any drugstore or grocery store. I think they even sell it at Dollar General. Yeah, they carry the Rexall brand of vitamins, and I think there's a Rexall does a St. John's wort, and that's a good quality vitamin brand actually at a pretty good price. So no reason you shouldn't have this one around. Really fascinating plant, and honestly, we barely scraped the surface, even though we went over several continents and several different cultures and all kinds of very interesting use. Y'all have a great week, and I'll talk to you next time.
The information in this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or condition. Nothing I say or write has been evaluated or approved by the FDA. I'm not a doctor. The U.S. government does not recognize the practice of herbal medicine, and there is no governing body regulating herbalists. Therefore, I'm really just a guy who studies herbs. I'm not offering any advice. I won't even claim that anything I write or say is accurate or true. I can tell you what herbs have been traditionally used for. I can tell you my own experience and if I believe an herb has helped me. I cannot nor would I tell you to do the same. If you use an herb anyone recommends, you are treating yourself. You take full responsibility for your health. Humans are individuals and no two are identical. What works for me may not work for you. You may have an allergy, a sensitivity, an underlying condition that no one else even shares and you don't even know about. Be careful with your health. By continuing to listen to my podcast or read my blog, you agree to be responsible for yourself, do your own research, make your own choices, and not to blame me for anything ever.